Our second presenter this afternoon is Lady Gillian Deane. In preparing this introduction, I quickly realised that Gillian is a woman with formidable energy. Her passions revolve around advocating for those with disabilities, rare disorders, working for the arts, genealogy, and her extraordinary garden, to my mind. As an aside, today, Gillian and Roderick are selling copies of their lovely book, A Guide to Mai, the proceeds of which they are very generously donating to the Australian Garden History Society. You can purchase that at afternoon tea, and it will also be for sale again tomorrow as well. Gillian is the chair and founder of the Deane Endowment Trust. She is the patron of Intellectually Handicapped Children New Zealand. She was previously the trustee of the Arts Foundation of New Zealand, the International Festival of the Arts, the Diana Princess of Wales Trust, the New Zealand Organisation of Rare Disorders, the Centre for Clinical Research and Effective Practice, and patron of the Mary Potter Hospice in Wellington. As I said, a woman with formidable energy. This afternoon, Gillian is going to share with us her discovery of illustrator Sarah Phaeton and how she has used New Zealand plants in her own garden to create Te Mai. Please join me in welcoming Gillian.
Thank you, Bronwyn, for those kind words. Good afternoon to our patron, our president, and ladies and gentlemen. Fiona, you've really given a wonderful history. I don't have to say anything about how wonderful natives are because they all believe you. But I'd like to talk about then and now and to introduce you to a 19th century botanic artist, Sarah Phaeton, who painted New Zealand flora. In doing so, she always had beside her Sir Joseph Hooker's Handbook of New Zealand Flora. And to Gillian Deane, who's loved New Zealand natives for as long as she can remember. Once I knew I was part Maori, I could understand the depth of this intense emotion. The Australian Garden History Society is celebrating the explosion of botanical knowledge since Captain James Cook first landed 250 years ago in Gisborne, on the east coast of New Zealand. By a happy coincidence, Sarah and I have both lived in Gisborne. 120 years after the initial collection of so many plants in the area, Sarah and Edward Phaeton were caught with botanical fever. They had eminent New Zealand botanists such as Professor Thomas Cook and more amateur botanists, but very well-read botanists such as Bishop William Colenso and Bishop William Williams sending specimens to them. Interesting, they also had a lot of nurserymen who sent specimens too. The former Governor Grey was also on Edward's list, and I found a letter to George Grey asking to send specimens from his Kawa Island. Sarah's paintings were featured in a 180-page book, an art album of New Zealand flora, published in 1888. It was the first book published in New Zealand with colour illustrations. The chromolithographic process dramatised the colour of Sarah's delicate paintings. Chris Webb, who was the treasurer of the Royal New Zealand Horticultural Institute, lent me a copy of this album. It had been given to his great-grandfather in 1888 when he was Minister of Lands. I was captured by the beautiful detail of Sarah's paintings and spent the next 4 months researching her life and work. Edward and Sarah worked together on this challenging project. His florid Victorian prose gives an insight into how the Phaetons felt about New Zealand plants. Edward Rather similarly to Fiona, writes that the publication was based on scientific and systematic principles. He describes the great variety of New Zealand plants and mentions the luxuriant tropical Nepal palm and the quaint cordyline or cabbage tree. Like me, Sarah was fortunate to have a husband who was so supportive of her passion for New Zealand flora. In the 1890s, the Phetons were living in Gisborne, and at that time, Bishop John Kinder painted the settlement of Gisborne, on the left, and he also walked throughout New Zealand, and he came down near to our garden at Waikanai, and there's a Maori Pa site at Waikanai painted by John Kinder about the same time. It's interesting to note on all the hills the forest has disappeared. Writing about the land clearing practices of the 19th century, the eminent Canadian historian, distinguished Professor John Weaver, observed, by the 1920s, commercially popular species were becoming rare because of the exploitation by the colonists. Predominant species met a wasteful exploitation. Notice this very careful historian uses this word twice in a sentence. The wasteful exploitation by crude land clearing onslaughts. Today, only 10% of the original wetlands remain, but resuscitation is occurring. Today, the Queen Elizabeth Trust has 84,000 hectares of native planting and wetlands protected by over 3,000 covenants with private landowners and farmer-held covenants. In our rural neighbourhood, we live on the remnants of a once vast Te Hapua swamp. Many of our neighbours are planting native trees, revegetating old farm paddocks, and restoring the swamp to give the wetland plants and the native birds an opportunity to flourish. Our road has a very high density of QE2 covenants to protect the wetlands and the precious native trees. As Fiona said, 80% of New Zealand flora is only found in New Zealand. Our garden is about 30 acres of a 90-acre property. So Roderick says, I still have another 60 acres to go. Our dream of a New Zealand garden began from looking at the shape of the dunes and the wetlands. With appropriate resource consents and some advice from experts, we removed the weed infestation from the wetlands, planted tens of thousands of native trees and shrubs. In pursuit of the Phetons' love of native flora and their wish that New Zealand natives be fully appreciated, we've planted art and restored about 30 acres so far. Many of our neighbours have done the same. If we'd known about the extent of the challenges, would we have been so enthusiastic about the venture? I did give Roderick a pair of gumboots when he retired from being a chief executive, and he looked as though they weren't the nicest gift he's ever got, but gosh, he wears them every day now. We've had to cope with dry, sandy soil, fierce coastal winds, no shelter initially, severe frosts, a lack of rain in summer, and too many hungry rabbits and pukekos. The pictures of Roderick and me in the very early days. I think Sarah and Edward would be reassured by the impact of their wonderful book on so many gardeners. So I have used some of Sarah's most dramatic paintings of flowers, which signal a new season. The kowhai holds a special place in New Zealanders' hearts. Sarah's painting on the left, whoops, sorry, I've done it again. Oh. Sarah's painting on the left, our kowhai on the right, and Pahutakawa tree, Sarah's painting on the left, Gillian's photograph on the right, but look at the detail of Sarah's Hutakawa bracts. They're absolutely beautiful.